Hello everyone, welcome to this session about a few useful Pandas built-in methods. Today we will be understanding the Pandas shift method. We will start off by looking at the documentation of the shift method on the official Pandas documentation website. Um, so the shift method is applied on a Pandas data frame, and it is basically used to move the data frame rows or columns relative to the indices, right? um, the period parameter is what is the number that specifies by how much the indices or the rows or the columns will move. Frequency is a flag that is used to denote whether the indices will shift relative to the rows or columns, or whether the rows or columns will be shifted while the indices remain the same in the same position. The axis, like any other data frame method, denotes whether you would like to work with rows or with the columns. The fill value, as you will see later, is used as the default value that will be filled in when the rows or columns are shifted. Moving back to our example, let's look at how shift works with a very simple example. We have here a pandas data frame. The pandas data frame is basically just a result card of, let's say, the sales of a particular company. Let's run that and see what the data frame looks like. Here we see that we have a data frame with 3 columns: sales, region code and personnel, and 5 rows, right? Now let's try to shift the data frame by 3 positions. How will we do that using the shift method? We do that by typing in the data frame name, that is df, followed by the shift method, followed by the periods parameter. So if you type in periods equals 3, this should shift the data frame rows by 3 positions. You will see here that the top 3 rows, which were previously populated by certain numbers, have now been replaced by the nan value. The first and the second rows have been shifted down up until the 4th and the 5th rows. Why has this happened? This has happened because we shifted by offset of 3. What that means is the rows are pushed downward, the upper rows are replaced by nan values because they are blank, whereas the bottom 3 rows are now dropped off from the data frame altogether. Let's try another example. This time let's try moving the columns, right? So how would we do the same kind of operation but move the columns offset? So how do we do that? We start off again with the data frame variable. We give it the shift method and give it the periods by which it is shifted. So we will be only shifting the columns by 1, and we specify the axis parameter. The axis parameter is where we specify that the offset should happen on the columns and not the rows. Let's see what happens. You'll see that one complete row of sales is now replaced by the nan values, and the values that were previously in sales have now moved towards the region code column, and the ones in region code have now moved to personnel. So the last column, which was actually personnel, has been dropped off from the data frame, right? This is what happens when you're shifting by columns. Let's say we do not want to use nan values as defaults. What if we want to replace nan values or use different default values? In that case, we will be using the fill value parameter. How does that work? You use data frame, the df variable. You start off with the shift method. You use the periods parameter to specify by how much you want to shift it, and you give it the fill value parameter as well. The fill value parameter in this case will be 0, so we want all the new rows or the blank rows to be replaced by 0 values, right? We are now going back to shifting it row wise and not column wise, so please bear that in mind. Let's run this and see what happens. You'll see that previously we had nan values, but this here is now being replaced by 0 when your fill value parameter is set to a certain value, right? Great. Last but not the least, what do we do if we want to shift only certain columns and not others? Or let's say we want to only shift certain rows from certain columns and not the others, right? For example, let's consider that we want sales to remain in the same position, but we want to add an offset to region code and personnel. In that case, we will use the column identifiers and move only those columns by a certain offset. We use the double bracket notation here because we are specifying certain columns and not all. So we specified the two columns that we would like to offset. We will again say that these are the specific columns that we want to move. We have to make sure that the columns are named correctly. And we add the dot shift method. We do not need to specify the parameter every time. If you are only specifying the one parameter, let's specify it as 3, for example, and run the code. This time when we try to see what DF looks like, it will show you that only the region code and the personnel columns, the rows in the region code and personnel columns have moved by an offset of 3, right? Let's redefine the data frame again, just because I'd like to have it start off clean. Right. So going back to the original example of sales, region code and personnel, what if I wanted to offset certain rows, but I wanted to offset them upwards and not downwards? So the examples that we saw up until now were offsetting the rows downwards and were offsetting the columns towards the right. Let's say we wanted to offset it upwards, that is, we want the rows to move up and the default values to start from the bottom. What happens in that case, and how would you do it, right? So in that particular situation, in that particular example, we will basically shift, and you will shift it by a negative number. So let's say I wanted to shift the rows upwards by 2 positions or 2 rows. I will give it a -2 parameter and run it. So you'll see here that the rows are moved upwards by 2 positions. These are the bottom 3 rows, and we have nan replacing the values on the bottom. The top 2 rows have been dropped off, right? Another thing to note is that the shift method returns a fresh data frame. That is, your original data frame will remain as is and is not affected by the shift operation. It will always return a fresh data frame which you can assign to a new variable. That's it from my end about the shift method. Please do refer to the documentation for additional information. Thank you.